Andaaz.
What we produce in our free version in terms of the mesh density is a couple of orders of magnitude less dense than what the algorithms will actually produce.
Okay.
So, I mean, we could just get amazingly refined detail, and it's actually a little bit proportional to the amount of texture detail that that the object is giving off. So
Okay.
it'll do a horrible job on this white wall.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be horrible, right? Because there's no textural differentiation on it. But something like, beach sand,
Oh, okay.
is genius, right?
Yeah,
Because,
yeah.
like almost every particle is different,
Yeah,
right? So it
okay.
picks all that stuff out, and that's what it uses to actually, it identifies, this thing is here in this view, and when I move over there, I see it on a different plane.
Yeah.
But so it's finding the same thing across all those frames.
Okay.
And so obviously the more things you have to identify, the higher the resolution of that result.
And is it just scanning the surface, or can it get density and hollow areas and that kind of stuff yet?
Not yet.
Not
So
yet.
not with the photogrammetric technique. So there's other techniques that you can use. This technique is analogous to the one that you, from an MRI scan or a CAT scan, the sort of, view from one angle multiple times and then reconstruct that 3D object. If we had the ability to see into things using a camera, we'd be able to reconstruct that data.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
an ultrasonic, version, or, some backscattering system would probably be able to see even deeper.
Because if the detail gets extreme enough that you can get into something and almost molecularly have a 3D representation of it,
It gets-
you could start cloning.
Wow, yeah. Well,
Maybe,
well-
not animals, but maybe objects, and depending on how you can reconstruct it. If the printing capability is able to one by one put it back together. Can you see that happening within the next X amount of time?
No,
Possibly?
no, we're not going to do it that way.
Okay.
So it's unlikely that we're actually going to directly output things that are at that tiny scale using a top-down process. What we're actually going to do is we're going to create self-assembling things that come from the bottom up. And we teach those tiny little particles, if you will, how to behave.
DNA. You're talking
well,
DNA.
We may use DNA as the instructions for cells. Create specific DNA that instruct the cell how to behave in a novel way to create larger structures from those tiny bits.
Yeah.
So I actually have here they are. Here's some examples of that. And there's a bigger example over here. There's actually several.
So it's essentially the idea of DNA only transcribed over into kind of a...
No, it is DNA.
Oh, it is DNA? Okay, I was thinking if you're talking nanotechnology, you're talking maybe machinery
Yeah.
implemented into that a little bit? Or is it are you talking just cellularly creating things?
Well, the interesting thing about using cells is that they, even if you think about 3D printing, right? 3D printing today takes a long time because every drop of material has to be put down one by one sequentially. This drop, then this drop, then this drop, then this drop. So if you think about cells, you know that they divide by twos, right? So you get an exponential growth very, very quickly, right? So after 7 generations, you've got 128 times as much as you did before, as an example, right? Not just 7 more than you had before.
Yeah.
So that's important. So we can use cells and we can use biology to grow structures if we instruct the cells correctly. And we're working on research right now to do just that. So these are models of bacteria that have been grown into specific structural shapes that have specific functional properties. Like, for example, this one will only bend in this direction. It won't bend in the other direction. I can't fold it this way. This one has flexibility only in certain spots. This one, we instructed the bacteria to collectively make a table. So if we can instruct bacteria to participate together to literally deposit calcium in this case in certain areas to make hard surfaces versus flexible surfaces, we may be able to grow larger and larger structures in the future. And we're actually working together, this may sound astonishing, with major companies like, for example, Airbus, who is interested in this kind of technique to maybe one day grow airplane fuselages.
Wow, so it's cells that are making rigid structures, not living organisms. It
Right.
starts essentially as a living organism.
So there's another one over here that I can help to
You guys
explain it.
ditched nanotechnology and just went to the
Bio.
huh?
Yeah, let's go to bio.
Yeah.
Yeah, just go all the way down.
You don't need to buy any bots.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is if you think about, when people talk about nanotechnology and nanomachines, you must imagine the cell really is a factory. It is already a machine that does something. And what it does is programmed by its DNA. As we understand more about DNA, as we understand more about the functions of how these things work, and as they become more computable so that we can design in the computer the functions that we want to have, we have a chance of creating new cells, new types of factories that will perform new functions that'll interest us. So here's an example of a car that Daimler's working on. This is a thought experiment that they put together for what would it be like in the future if cars were grown from seeds. And I think that's really compelling because today, when we want to materialize a car or really any kind of object like this, our techniques are really crude. We have heat it, beat it, or treat it. In the future, it may be grow it. This particular car has some interesting structures to it. What I like about it is it has it kind of looks a little bit like a vertebrae or a structure you might find inside of a giant whale or something like that. This model is meant to represent a car that might in the future be made of something like bone. And bones themselves are constructed from cells in our body that deposit bones in area where we need strength and erode the bone in areas where we don't use it. So if you really project even past this car, sometime in the future we might even have objects that remain responsive and still participate in a design process even after they're manufactured. They still continue to evolve, if you will. So the design process won't stop at the moment of manufacture, but it'll just continue on and on and on. And we'll have an ability to tweak how those things behave and perform as they continue in the environment around us.
The question was, so is an engineer actually saying these are the points that have to be rigid? Or is...
They put the design objective in exactly at that intentional level. Make this rigid, make this flexible.
Gotcha.
And then the cells will figure out how to do that.
Wow.
They'll figure out where the stuff needs to be deposited in order to make that come true.
That's incredible.
So, there's a great use case. I mean, when you're at iGym, I don't know if you saw, if maybe Andrew had this example, I think it was from a couple years ago, maybe he shared it, these really cool E. coli that were re-engineered to heal cracks in concrete.
Didn't hear about that.
It's a great example, and it's, they taught bacteria how to secrete a calcium material that was strong enough to bind concrete. And the way that the stuff works is you spread this E. coli on a crack, and it will multiply until it gets crowded into the dark, dark, dark parts of the crack, way deep inside, where the crack is really tight, where it's really originating. And when it gets in there and it can't grow any further, it senses that it's too close to its neighbors, and it switches the kind of offspring that it creates, and its children will now stay put, but secrete this calcium that will heal the crack from the inside out. I think it's a remarkable use case.
How is that not already mass
Deployed?
produced? Like, yeah,
Well, I don't know how you keep the bacteria alive and stuff like that. They got some things to think about in there. But, the possibility for, programming bacteria this way is really pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
there's another great example where they taught another form of bacteria to sense arsenic in water and then glow green, like that color green that when you break a light stick, when it detects the arsenic. That's pretty cool. So they took like firefly green, right, and arsenic detector and combined them together to, create a new form of bacteria that can sense and display the presence of this poison. So you imagine something that's so easy to reproduce in quantities, and now you can distribute it so cheaply to areas that might be affected by industrial runoff, poisoning a well. And before you drink water from the well, maybe you put a drop of this stuff in, and if it glows green, don't drink it. I like these solutions.
I love those solutions. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably like
It's in Bangladesh now, so that's where they've actually deployed it.
Of course,
Yeah.
it has to go to India. That's where the war.
Oh, they turned these screens off. I don't know why. That's a bummer.
Oh, you want the projectors back on? I turned the lights back on. I have them turn the projectors back on.
I guess. I mean, I don't know what they've got powered down and what already.
I turned all the lights back on, but not the projectors.
If you're getting enough stuff,
I will probably, I mean, not to,
I really like this Lego dinosaur as an example of all the different sorts of levels inside of a complicated design. So when you first look at it, you could see that this overall dinosaur creature is made up of thousands and thousands of Legos. So how'd they figure out what Lego goes where? I think that's kind of interesting. But then when you look at the individual pieces themselves, you realize that each of these pieces is so precise. How did they actually come up with those pieces so they'd fit together so regularly? And then you think about the process of actually molding those things in plastic in some factory somewhere, and the fact that Lego actually has to produce millions and millions of these. How did they come up with making the mold for those things? And if you go around on the far side over here, you'd see that, boy, when they go and want to display one of these giant structures at Legoland, they've got some structural engineering that they put together to make sure that this thing actually stands up in the park without falling over on one of the participants at the park. There's so many different levels of this, from sort of the macro experience down to the tiny little detail that's all part of design. And I think that whole spectrum of the process is really interesting. Something I like about this exhibit is that, so this is a device that's meant to preserve the life of babies that have been born prematurely. And if you think about the way that this has been approached in the past, you often see things that look like wash tubs, plastic objects that, maybe even something that looks a little bit like this, and the baby's placed in it and preserved away. And one of the things that, one of the roles of a designer is really to understand all of the different requirements of the problem. And one of the problems that has never really been solved with the old devices like this is the need for the baby and the mother to be close together. And I think that this is really an interesting outcome of really inspecting the whole context of the design problem and coming up with a just as innovative approach where you use a exothermic material like this, like you'd find in a hand warmer, right? That can be placed inside of the pouch to keep the baby warm, but also keep the baby close to the mother.
That's so sweet.
Isn't that cool?
Yes, I love that one.
So all of these exhibits here are all really about design for social responsibility and just a different, considering a greater context of design. So not just design as the object, but design as a greater purpose. And so I like a number of these exhibits.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's most interesting about 3D printing is that, number one, it can print incredibly complicated objects just as easily as a blob of material. The printer just doesn't care. But what's even more remarkable is that these objects, when they come out of the printer, will already work. There's no assembly required. These things just function right out of the box, so to speak. So we've got examples like this, or this, that as they come out of the printer are already operational. And a variety of different things that, as you design in color or you design for different types of function, once they're completed in software, just as you today go file print and expect a page to come out of your inkjet printer or laser writer, in a 3D printer, they come out ready to go.
Here we're building through design a bridge. Mm-hmm. And what if something in your program kind of goes off a little bit, and here this bridge all of a sudden could destruct when you're driving over it? Or do you know what I'm saying? I mean, how do you ensure that? How does that process work?
Well, form is one aspect. The function is actually where the heart of design is today. And so exactly what you're talking about, how is that thing going to behave? How is it going to perform in the real world where it's got this context of cars driving
Yeah.
across it and wind blowing and waves crashing.
I mean, how does a
That's what our
just
software
amazing.
does. We can explore all those questions of would it be better if we did it this way or that way. And in fact, it can even help us get to not just the first answer that works, but really help explore until we find the very best answer.
Andaaz.